I don't think we want a whole video of this, AJ. Do something interesting.
Oh, hey there. Sorry about that. I was a little caught up thinking about the good old days and being nostalgic. Do you ever revisit older games that you've played, or maybe you play a remake and then realize that something just feels like it's missing? Like it's just not as fun as you remember it being, or maybe the remake is just bad. If you're anything like me, then you probably play a wide variety of video games, and yet you often find yourself wanting to recapture the magic of the earlier games that you used to play. Lately, I found myself revisiting quite a few titles, both for research purposes for this channel, but also because I've had a lot of strong levels of nostalgia that just pull me back to these games that I've played a million times. So because of that, I thought it'd be fun to talk about the nostalgia effect on video games.
He did it. He did it. He said the thing.
He said the title.
He did it. He said the thing.
Oh my God, he did it.
Watching right now. He said the thing. He said the thing.
Nostalgia is probably one of the weirdest emotions, because while its definition is pretty simple, being a sentimental or wistful affection for the past, it can quickly lead to feelings of both happiness or sadness, and in a lot of situations, sometimes both. This emotion is tied to absolutely everything we do and enjoy, video games included. I just finished playing Infernax in my free time, and I absolutely loved every moment of it. Yes, I'll do a job on it eventually, because trust me, I have a lot to say. For those who don't know, Infernax is a love letter to the NES age. The developers took all the best features of Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2, a couple of other NES titles, and smashed it all together into one game, but built with a modern day audience in mind. I'd been following this game all the way back when I first discovered it in 2015. Because from what I saw, it captured a lot of elements of games that I adore. I knew it was going to be a game made just for me, and after I got my hands on it, I was proven right. I played through that game over 10 times because I wanted to unlock everything. I wanted to see everything. And in that span of time, the way I experienced the game obviously changed. I went from seeing each new screen and wondering, where does this path lead? Or what happens if I go up when the game wants me to go down? To having every screen, every path, every enemy placement memorized. I enjoyed it all the same, but those initial feelings from when I first played through the game were gone, and I never get them back, just like that. That's what got me wondering though. I loved this game. It's what I needed. But will I ever be nostalgic for Infernax in the same way that I am for Zelda 2 or Castlevania 2? In 15 years, am I going to be longingly looking back onto the days of 2022 when Infernax came out? No one's ever going to long for 2022. At the end of 2021, I released a video that covered my top 5 holiday games, with the gist of the video being about games that I get nostalgic for during the holiday season. Now, I had put Mario Odyssey on that list, a game that I should in no way be nostalgic for, and yet I am. Every time the holidays roll around, I want to play Mario Odyssey, and yet I never do. Why? Well, I could say that I don't have the time, or my backlog of games is just too big, or anything else. But honestly, I think there's a lot more to it than that, because that's the trick with nostalgia. The memories are always much better than the actual experience, because whether we like to admit to it or not, there's always a million more variables and factors that go into play when we sit down to play a video game for the very first time. I'll give you an example. Let's look at Breath of the Wild. Now, I've been pretty open that I do enjoy Breath of the Wild as a video game. I do, but I don't think it's a great Zelda game. I played it launch day when I got my Switch, and over time, I 100% it. But as I let the game digest a little, I started to see more and more flaws with it. Things that I couldn't turn a blind eye to. However, as time went on, I found myself getting strangely nostalgic for it. I wanted to revisit it, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that the experience will never be the same ever again. I don't just mean the obvious stuff like knowing where things are now, but I mean the memories I had of getting this game. When the Switch released, I stood outside of Best Buy with my friend because we had both had it pre-ordered. We waited in line, got our Switches, picked up some Pro Controllers, and picked up Breath of the Wild, then went back to my place. I hooked up my Switch to my TV and pulled a spare TV out of the bedroom so he could hook up his Switch. We both dove into this new console, this new game, this whole new experience together. We sat there for hours playing Zelda. We got off the plateau around the same time. He went one way and I went another. There was a constant mix of wanting to show each other cool things we found, but also not wanting to spoil the other person. There was the initial rush you get from opening and messing around with a brand new console for the first time. Those memories will forever be tied to Breath of the Wild for me, and because of that outside influence, subsequent playthroughs won't ever be nearly as magical as that first time. This is true with any game, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't really sit down and think about. It's also a big reason as to why I feel that people are so often disappointed by remakes of games that they love, because no matter how accurate they are to the source material, in their head, there's just something that's missing, something that the developers can't recreate. The outside experiences, the memories tied to your first playthrough of the game, the life you were living when you first played a game. Essentially, people end up liking the idea of a remake, but because of all those memories and experiences, it never lives up to their standards, and therefore they think the execution is bad. However, nostalgia in video games can go hand in hand and often lead to great things. I already talked about Infernax briefly because it's a great example of a positive creation built from nostalgia. But another one is Shovel Knight. These games were so wildly enjoyable because while they were inspired by nostalgia, they also didn't let it limit them either. For instance, sure, Shovel Knight looks like an NES game, but for all intents and purposes, you could not play that game on an NES. It uses too many colors, a broader sound font. Hell, the entire game is technically 3D, so yeah. It certainly has the look and feel of an NES game, but the polish of a game built in 2014. The cool thing about nostalgia is that, generally speaking, the age of the developers reflects the era of games they might be the most nostalgic for. So while games like Infernax and Shovel Knight take obvious inspirations from the 80s and the NES era of gaming, there are games such as X Zodiac currently being developed that is currently inspired by the super low poly Star Fox games on the SNES. In fact, we're seeing indie devs who are now inspired by the nostalgia and love for the N64 and PS1 era, hell, even up to the PS2. It's an endless cycle, but it's also important to not let nostalgia stifle creativity. That goes for both the developer and the player base. And for that example, let's talk about Mega Man. This is a weird one because Capcom has kinda set themselves up to disappoint their diehard Mega Man fans, but to no fault of their own. For a quick Mega Man history lesson, the original 6 Mega Man games were all released on the NES and had a very distinctive 8-bit style to them. Meanwhile, a mere month after the release of Mega Man 6 on the NES, Mega Man X was released on the Super NES at the end of 1993. The art and music reflected the power of the SNES, and one could assume that this was the future of Mega Man going forward. But 2 Mega Man X games later, in March of 1995, we saw the release of Mega Man 7, also on the SNES. Because at this point, why wouldn't it be? But with a much different art style than what we were used to. Mega Man 7 was still considered classic Mega Man, but it also felt different. Almost clunkier, due in part to the very large sprites used. Time went on and we wouldn't see another classic Mega Man game until Mega Man 8 released at the end of 1996, but this time on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, with yet another dramatic shift in art style to better represent those two systems. This is all part of the classic series, and yet this is quite a large deviation from Mega Man 1 through 6. And that was it. No new Mega Man games. We saw more Mega Man X games, we saw the entire Mega Man Zero series, and in fact, we saw the entire Mega Man ZX series, and yet, no new classic Mega Man. It took 13 years, so well over a decade, until the surprise announcement of Mega Man 9 on the Wii. To everyone's surprise, they had reverted the art style all the way back to represent that of the NES. Similar to Shovel Knight, just because Mega Man 9 looks like an NES game, it's still much more advanced and couldn't actually run on an NES. But it certainly captured the feel of those games flawlessly, including some quality of life improvements. For the time anyway. To classic fans like me, this was amazing. This hadn't been done before, and never did I realize how much I wanted to play a new 8-bit classic Mega Man game. At the time, this game felt like it was made for me. 2 years later in 2010, we saw the release of Mega Man 10, and it was still in the 8-bit style. Yet, while the reviews of this game were mostly positive, and Mega Man 10 did sell well, it didn't take much time for people to already be bored with the return of 8-bit. It would take another 8 years until we received Mega Man 11, with yet another drastic change in art style and gameplay. So much so that while Mega Man 11 is still a fun Mega Man game, it feels like a huge departure from the rest of the classic series. So where does that leave the future of the classic Mega Man series? Honestly, who knows? For me, I'll always prefer the classic NES style. However, if Mega Man 12 is one day released looking the same as Mega Man 11, I'll still play it and I'm sure I'll still enjoy it. But I already know that I'm not going to play it nearly as much, because when Mega Man 11 released, I played through it, I beat it, I did basically everything I could with it, and then I just never went back to it. Meanwhile, I can't count the amount of times I've played through the NES games, including Mega Man 9 and 10, but a big part of that is due to nostalgia. Another example I find fascinating is the Pokemon series, because while the reception of each new game is mostly positive, it can never quite recapture the magic of your first game, no matter when that was. The irony with Pokemon, though, is that it's constantly trying to play with our nostalgia. Whether it's by bringing back classic trainers and characters from earlier entries, or hearing a familiar song, or gifting us Pokemon from an earlier generation partway through the game, there's always these little breadcrumbs left by the developers that seem like they were meant for the fans of the earlier games. The issue with that, though, is for newer players to the series, a lot of those interactions are completely lost on them, and two, they typically overdo it, leading to the opposite effect happening. Looking at you, Charizard! Let some other starters have a spotlight. God damn it! Lastly, of course, is the uphill battle against nostalgia that remakes go through. Now, just to put this out here, I'm actually not going to include games like Final Fantasy VII Remake in this, because yes, while it has remake in the title, it is a vastly different game, and in fact, even a different genre than the original. So really, that would require a video in its own right. Instead, I would like to draw your attention to The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. When I saw the trailer for the Link's Awakening remake on Switch, I was actually pretty shocked to see that they were remaking one of my favorite Zelda games. A game that they had technically already remade once before for the Game Boy Color. I was elated to experience this world again. The idea that there might even be more of Koholint Island to see and explore was exciting. When it came to the art style, I thought it looked great. Visually, I was so excited to get my hands on it. Then I did. Now, the sudden dramatic pause there probably makes it seem like I didn't like the remake on Switch, but that's actually not true. I enjoyed my time with it, but the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color versions had, well, have such a strong nostalgic grip on me that there was just no way it was going to compare. It was hard for me to get lost in this world because it wasn't the world I remembered. It wasn't how I envisioned it in my head. I quickly realized that the diorama look that they went for, while cute and charming, absolutely killed my level of immersion. When I play the original versions, my brain is still trapped back in the early 90s with how I picture the game in my head. So the island, to me, was much larger than it actually was. For instance, take this screen to the south of the town shop. See how there's this wall of trees here? In my mind's eye, as a child, to me that was a forest. There was something over there that I couldn't get to, I couldn't see, but I knew it was there. Sure, I could just go up a screen, over to the right, then back down and see what was there, being a screen with a phone booth and a couple of Octoroks, and while I could look at the map and see that I was exactly one screen to the right of Mabe Village, it didn't matter. Is it Mabe or maybe? I've always said maybe until I read it just now and I decided to go for Mabe because I got really self-conscious about saying maybe, but now I'm not sure, so what do you think? Regardless though, even though I knew I was only one screen to the right, the immersion was still working. But in the remake, due to the diorama design and camera angle, I can stand right here in Mabe Village and just see out to this area so clearly. This wall of trees now looks so out of place and I no longer feel like I'm as immersed in this set piece. This is how the entire island is in the remake. If you walk to the edge of where a screen would normally end, you can very clearly see an area that in the original game you would have had no access to seeing. I went into this game thinking my view of Koholint was going to broaden, when in fact, it shrunk. That isn't to say that the remake is a bad game though. That's the whole point, is that I know there are plenty of people whose first and maybe only experience with Link's Awakening will be the remake, and that's totally fine. I just wanted to use this as an example to showcase the trap that nostalgia can put us in. Since I played the original as a kid, those dumb child thoughts and memories that I had have stuck with me for literal decades. The logical side of me knows how games are made now. I know there's not secret areas just off screen, but the nostalgia lets a small piece of that linger. So when I go back and play the original games, I can still have those thoughts of, I wonder what's over there. It's me, I'm over there. I think this is a big part of why it can be so enjoyable to watch someone else play a game for the first time. You get to vicariously experience the game for the first time, but through someone else's eyes. It's exciting to see how they will take in or react to certain scenes and scenarios, and often you might see them do something that completely contradicts what you'd think they'd do because you know the game so well. Sure, it's not the same as playing the game yourself, but it's an outlet that is as close to the initial experience as you're going to get. I'd also say that, in my case anyway, watching someone else play a game, be it casually or as a speedrun, can almost be considered like a coping mechanism, for lack of a better term. What I mean by that is I think there's a part of me that knows that if I go back and replay certain games, they're just not going to be as entertaining as I built them up to be in my head. So, to prevent any sort of disappointment from being attributed to games that I love, I just forego playing them and instead watch somebody else do it. Ultimately though, I just think the topic of nostalgia and video games is fascinating, and it's wild to me that you just never know when you're going to become nostalgic for a video game. It could be something you haven't touched for 20 years, or it could be something you played 4 years ago that just so happens to coincide with a big life event. So what are your thoughts on nostalgia in video games? Do you think it's holding us back creatively, or do you think it's a big proponent in propelling us forward? Let me know. And in the meantime, I'm gonna go back to complaining about never having time to play video games while I watch someone else do it for multiple hours a day. Let me know. And in the meantime, I think I'm due for some nostalgia myself. Remember the beginning of this video?
I don't think we want a whole video of XIJ. Do something interesting.
Oh!